Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
They're blowing up my phone like the world is ending, and I know exactly why. But before I tell you what I did that finally made them hear me, you need to understand the ground rules of my family, because there were always rules even when nobody said them out loud. And the first rule was that my brothers mattered and I did not, which meant every plan bent around their wants. Every expense found a way to become my problem, and every good thing I did was treated like a favor I owed rather than an effort I made. I have two brothers, Michael and Daniel, and from the time we were kids it was understood that they were the main show while I was the backstage crew, so birthdays looked like rented bounce houses for them and a modest cake for me that I cut myself. Parent-teacher meetings turned into my mom telling teachers that the boys were competitive while I was the reliable helper, and when college happened the conversation was not about where I might thrive, but about how my schedule could stay flexible. Enough to drive Michael to practice and proofread Daniel's applications, which I did anyway because that is what you do when you have been trained to keep the family machine running, and you are told it only runs if you keep your head down. People love to say that families even out once everyone becomes an adult, but what actually happens is that the habits harden. So the boys graduated into apartments paid with deposits from my parents, while I signed the lease on a studio and took on extra shifts that I did not complain about, and when Michael needed a car my parents called it an investment in his future. While when I needed a dental procedure my mom asked me to look into a cheaper clinic because I had strong pain tolerance and could manage, which sounded like a joke until it was not, and I sat there calculating the cost and realizing that the only person who would notice if I postponed it was me. You might think I resented the boys, and sometimes I did, but what I really resented was the part of me that kept volunteering for more, because I was the person who would Venmo the difference when the check came up short. Who would cancel a night off to watch a niece so my parents could help Daniel with something urgent? Who would pick up a prescription and then get told that Michael looked tired and deserved a weekend away? And I started hearing a voice in my head that said this is not a phase, this is a system with a budget and a schedule and a list of names, and mine is written in pencil. It got ridiculous in small ways that add up, like my name being listed as the emergency contact on my parents' medical forms while they told the cousins that Michael was the rock of the family. Or my mom calling me her steady girl while handing Daniel the spare keys to their place, and every time I swallowed it, smiled, and kept the calendar moving because it seemed easier to carry the weight than to fight over it. Until one afternoon at my own apartment when I opened my banking app and saw 3 automatic transfers running every month that I had set up years ago and never questioned. The family phone plan I covered because it had started as a temporary fix, the car insurance rider for my parents' vehicle because it lowered the premium, and a quiet autopay for their streaming and cloud storage that had somehow become mine after a card update, which felt minor next to rent and payroll at my business, yet it was a ledger of a story I did not want to be in anymore. So I tested something small that felt huge to me, not a speech, not a fight, just a change in the pattern that had become my second skin, and I logged in, removed my card from the extras, set my own line to individual billing, canceled the add-ons that were not mine to carry, and updated the settings so I was no longer primary on anything, and then I texted my mom and said, in plain words, that I was tightening my budget and that they should put their own card on the account by the end of the week, which was not a threat, not a tantrum, just a boundary that I had never once drawn, and I expected maybe a sigh or a guilt trip, but what I got was silence until late that night. My mother sent a cheerful message about how Michael got a new client and Daniel was planning a barbecue, with a little note that said she knew I would be proud of my brothers and that the family phone was already sorted, which told me the message had been received and tossed into the same drawer where my needs always went. The next morning my dad called to ask if I could pick up an order for him on the way to work because his truck was in the shop, and I said I could not this time, and he paused like the line had gone dead and then said that family helps family, and I said I know. And I am family too, and we hung up in that polite way that hides a bruise, and I felt both shaky and clear, because once you say one honest thing the second one gets easier, which is probably why I opened the group chat with my brothers, and typed that from now on I would not be the default organizer, or the quiet payer, or the person who makes the errands disappear, and I muted the thread before the responses came in, because I did not need to read them to know the tone. That was the first move, quick and clean and almost invisible unless you were me, and maybe it sounds small, but it changed the story in my head, and it set up everything that followed. Because when you stop funding the arrangement, you stop apologizing for existing, and that is the moment when people either adjust or they punish you, and I did not have to wait long to find out which way my family would go. Because the call that finally snapped something in me came the very next week, and it was so bold that even I could not pretend it was normal. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the middle of payroll, and the tone in my mother's voice carried that familiar mix of cheer and pressure that always meant a new obligation was about to be wrapped in the word family. Because according to her, there was a small favor that would change everything for all of us, which sounded innocent until she explained that Daniel had an exciting opportunity and the bank needed a cosigner with a clean record and steady income, and of course I fit that description perfectly since, in her words, I was the only one who handled money like a grown-up. I listened while she described the plan that had been presented to her by the loan officer as a formality, and she spoke in those phrases that let people lie to themselves, saying it would not cost me a cent, and it would be temporary, and I would be protecting my brother from predatory rates. Yet every part of my body understood that what she wanted was for me to strap my future to his decisions, because it was easier to risk my stability than to ask her golden boys to sit with the consequences of their choices. And when I asked basic questions about collateral and default and interest, she got flustered and told me I was being dramatic, which is what people say when the math does not support their story. I did not raise my voice or break down, because this time I was not trying to be understood. I was trying to be precise, so I said I would review the papers and email the bank myself. And my mother laughed in that light way that always told me she thought I would come around after I calmed down, which only made me calmer. And after we hung up, I sat at my desk remembering the dental procedure I delayed while my parents financed Michael's upgraded SUV in the name of safety, the time they asked me to manage the registry and the venue deposit for Daniel's wedding while telling the room he had paid for everything himself, and the afternoon I transferred money to cover my parents' property tax because a notice had slipped under a stack of mail. After which they handed Michael a surprise weekend trip because he looked stressed, and that was the reel that played while I opened a clean document and made a list of every account where my name had ever been added out of convenience or momentum. Before I touched a single form, I called a banker I trust and asked her to walk me through the worst-case scenario as if I were a stranger, and she did not sugarcoat a thing, explaining that a cosigner is not a moral supporter but a legal twin to the debt, that late payments would stain my record before I even had a chance to argue, and that a default would aim straight at me because I am the one who answers phone calls and keeps my address current, and when I thanked her and ended the call, I felt oddly steady because the rulebook was now written down in my own words. I took the rest of the afternoon and turned the quiet boundary from last week into a system, placing a freeze on my credit with all 3 bureaus, setting fraud alerts with my bank, removing myself as a trusted contact on my parents' investment account where I had been listed for emergencies, revoking an old power of attorney that had been signed years ago when my dad had surgery and everyone was emotional, and sending simple, courteous emails to every institution that still showed me as a secondary on anything that was not mine, with one clear sentence in each message that said future requests must be in writing and cannot be approved by phone, which is the kind of sentence that saves entire lives. When my mother called back that evening to say she had booked a meeting at the bank for Friday and that she would bring the forms to dinner so we could sign quickly, I told her I would not be attending and that I would not be co-signing. And she went very quiet before switching strategies, moving from flattery to guilt to the old line about how she and my father had sacrificed for all of us. And I told her that I had noticed who exactly benefited from those sacrifices and that I had no interest in subsidizing more of the same, after which she said I was turning my back on family and I said I was turning my face toward myself, a phrase that sounded dramatic even to me, yet it felt accurate and I did not take it back. The next morning, I woke up to a string of messages from Michael about how this loan was the chance for Daniel to finally build something that would support the whole family, followed by Daniel himself saying I would not even feel it and that a good sister would help. And by lunchtime, an aunt had chimed in with a long note about grateful daughters, and I muted the thread and sent one email to the bank contact listed on the proposed documents asking for copies and for confirmation that my personal credit would be assessed, and an hour later I received an automated alert that a hard inquiry had been attempted under my name and had been blocked by the freeze, which told me more than any family speech ever could. For a minute, I considered letting it all slide again, because peace is addictive even when it is fake. But then my phone rang with Daniel on the other end pretending not to know about the inquiry, while asking if I could meet them at our parents' house that night to sign a pre-approval packet the banker had kindly prepared. And I said that if there was anything with my name on it, we would be reviewing it with my attorney present, at which point the temperature dropped and he called me selfish and said I was making a big mistake, and I told him I finally agreed with him because I had made big mistakes for years and I had just stopped making them. I did not show up that night, I did not bend. And as a small but pointed reminder that the script had changed, I mailed my parents a neat packet with every revoked authorization and a brief letter stating that any use of my identity or credit would be treated as fraud and that communication about money must happen by email, and while that might sound cold, it was the cleanest revenge I have ever taken because it stripped away the fog and replaced it with plain rules, and a few hours later my phone lit up with panicked calls and blurry messages about how I had embarrassed the family and ruined everything, and I let it ring while I made dinner and waited for the part one knew was coming, the moment when someone would finally say the quiet thing out loud. Which is exactly what happened the next day when my father called to deliver one final request that would force me to make a decision I could never walk back. My father called the next afternoon with that measured calm he uses when he wants something to sound reasonable before the edges show, and after a few polite lines about how busy I must be, he moved straight to the point, saying the bank had suggested a cleaner approach that would save everyone time, and that all they needed was my business identification number and a quick signature to let my account stand as proof of liquidity for Daniel's loan, which he described as a technicality that would never touch my day-to-day operations, and then he added that the banker had already prepared language to make me feel comfortable, which sounded like an apology drafted by somebody who has no intention of changing anything, because the comfort here would exist only on paper while the risk would sit in my lap. I asked him who gave the banker my name and which accounts were referenced, and he said it was standard internal processing and that I was overthinking it, that a good family works as one unit, and that I had built something strong enough to hold everyone for a while, which landed with the kind of dull thud that tells you the decision was made before you were invited to the conversation, and when I said the answer was no, he went quiet in a way that made me picture him blinking at the wall, after which he tried a softer line about how my mother was not sleeping and how Daniel's opportunity would stabilize the whole family if we could get through this one stretch, and I told him as plainly as I could that I would not sign anything, that my business would not guarantee or front or pretend to promise a thing, and that any attempts to use my identity or accounts without my written consent would be treated as fraud without exception. He did not yell, which almost made it worse, because he moved to that tone men use in conference rooms where the outcome is already mapped, saying he understood I was emotional and that he had asked the banker to send the packet to my email so I could change my mind in private and avoid embarrassing anyone. And I told him to send whatever he wanted because I had already spoken to counsel and filed the freezes and prepared the letters, and I ended the call before he could corner me with a memory or a favor or a plea, because the only way to hold a boundary is to step away before you start explaining why you deserve to have one. When I opened my inbox, the packet was waiting with cheerful tabs and a cover note that thanked me for my partnership. And it took less than a minute to spot the clause that would have allowed the bank to draw verification from my operating account in the event of questions, which is the kind of little doorway people pretend they cannot see because it looks tidy on the page. And I forwarded the whole thing to my attorney with a short summary and then, on her advice, replied to the banker with a firm refusal, a revocation of consent to pull any report tied to me or my business, and a demand that my name be removed from all communications related to Daniel's loan, adding that any further contact would need to go through counsel, which felt heavy and clean at the same time. That night, while I was still drafting the notes I planned to keep on file, Daniel called from my parents' kitchen with Michael in the background tossing in helpful comments about loyalty and gratitude. And after a few minutes of circling, they said the part they had been walking around, that without my signature the deal might not go through and that our parents could fall behind on a couple of things they had been covering for the boys while everyone got on their feet, which told me what I had suspected for years, but never let myself say aloud, that the word family had been a layer of frosting spread over a stack of debts and favors I had been expected to keep upright forever. And I said I was sorry they were in a bind and that I would not be fixing it this time, at which point the warmth dropped away and they started listing the times they believed I had been helped, conveniently skipping the part where I paid the bill every time it mattered. I slept badly, not because I doubted myself, but because cutting through a story that old leaves your chest buzzing, and in the morning I made the decision that turned my boundary into a bright line. A decision that felt like revenge only because I had let things drag on for so long. And I logged into my business credit portal to remove every authorized user who had been added during that chaotic period when my dad had surgery and my mother was juggling appointments, a gesture that made sense at the time but had never been revisited, and I found 2 cards still active under Michael and Daniel's names that were tagged for fuel and incidentals, tiny limits that I had stopped tracking because they never spiked. And I closed them with a few clicks and documented the change, then scanned my personal cards and found a lingering gas account I had opened for my parents years ago to keep them moving between doctors, which I also closed with a polite note to customer support confirming that any future transactions would be disputed as unauthorized. By noon my phone was lighting up with a string of calls I let roll to voicemail, messages layered with outrage and disbelief and that particular kind of shock people feel when a quiet convenience evaporates, and the words were predictable. Accusations of pettiness and betrayal and cruelty delivered by voices that had never once called to ask me how I was paying my own bills while covering theirs, and I used the noise as a metronome while I finished the final step, which was to put every avenue of contact on rails I could live with, drafting a single email addressed to my parents and copied to both brothers that stated, in full sentences without apology, that I would not co-sign, guarantee, or front any loans, that all authorizations had been revoked, that any attempt to use my information would be referred to counsel and to the authorities, and that, effective immediately, I was not available by phone or in person for discussions about money. After which I blocked their numbers and set my inbox to filter anything from them into a folder named with the date, because I wanted a record in case I ever doubted myself. It should have felt cold, but it felt like oxygen, and while I heated leftovers and tried to remember when I had last tasted a meal without my jaw clenched, the landline at my shop rang with a number I did not recognize. A bank security office asking to verify whether I had requested third-party access to my accounts for a family member that morning, and as I confirmed the answer and hung up, I realized the quiet door I had just shut was only one side of the house, because behind it sat a network of expectations that had been quietly wired into my life through autopays, discounts, bundled services, and little permissions that looked harmless until they were stacked. And I understood that the only way to make this end was not to win an argument, but to reroute the power entirely, which is exactly what I started planning that night. A move so simple and final that when they finally saw it they would stop calling not because they were satisfied, but because there would be nothing left to negotiate. They kept calling and texting and forwarding voicemails through relatives who tried to sound neutral while repeating the same lines about family and loyalty, and I let the noise float past me while I did the only thing that ever changed anything in my life, which was to sit down with a clean pad, make a list that told the truth, and then move through it like a checklist that nobody else needed to see, because talking had never bought me a single ounce of safety in that house, and silence, when paired with paperwork, had started to work wonders. I began with the small hinges that had been ignored for years, logging into the accounts that had quietly tied my money to their routine, and I disabled every auto pay that did not belong to my life anymore. From the family cloud storage that had migrated to my card after an update, to the soft bundle of entertainment services that had looked harmless when the trial started, to the rider on my parents' insurance that had once lowered a premium and had since become a built-in expectation, and with each confirmation screen, I took a screenshot and filed it into a folder with dates and subject lines, not out of spite, but because I know how quickly a story gets rewritten when feelings flare and facts are not within reach. Then I called my bank and asked to open a dedicated operating account with restricted permissions, and I moved vendor payments there while I changed every routing number attached to my main account. An annoying chore that paid for itself the first time a recurring charge tried to ping the old path and failed, which was exactly the point, because the world I had been trapped in was not built on dramatic betrayals. It was built on tiny permissions that nobody noticed until they were stacked high. Enough to block daylight, so I unstacked them without speeches, and once the plumbing was different, the entire house felt different, and that is the kind of revenge that does not look like revenge until the first bill arrives without a safety net tucked inside it. Because I had seen how far people would go when they are used to a free path, I followed through on the identity protection steps my attorney had sketched out, confirming the fraud alerts with all 3 bureaus, requesting written acknowledgement from the bank that no third party could receive even view-only access without notarized consent, setting up 2-factor on every financial platform with a physical key I could keep on my person, creating a passphrase with my credit union that had nothing to do with birthdays or pets, and adding a simple instruction to every file that stated all requests must be made in writing and will receive a written response. Which sounds fussy until you realize that phone pressure is the favorite tool of anyone who counts on you folding when your voice shakes. Work needed attention as well, because too many vendors knew my brother's names from those months I had tried to be helpful during my dad's recovery, so I sent a calm, friendly memo to our regular suppliers letting them know that purchase orders would now be required for every transaction, that only 2 people could approve them, and that any order placed under a familiar family name without a valid PO number should be declined with a courtesy call to the office, and I added a dollar cap for petty cash along with a clear log, which meant nobody could stroll into the shop and lean on a long relationship to grab what they wanted and sort it out with me later, a habit that had bled time and money while I called it kindness. On the personal side, I closed the old post office box that had become the family's overflow drawer and opened a new one that only my accountant and my attorney knew. I removed myself as an emergency contact on medical portals where I had been listed by default and replaced my name with the 2 men who were always introduced at reunions as the backbone of the family. And I sent the hospitals and clinics a short form instructing them to direct non-patient billing to the person receiving the service rather than to the person who happens to answer the phone, which sounds like common sense until you live as the person who always answers the phone. For every move I made, there was an echo on my screen, a flood of messages that alternated between panic and annoyance and that syrupy tone people use when they think you can be coaxed back into your old role with a pat on the head and a story about how overwhelmed they are, and I did not reply. Not because I wanted to cause pain, but because I had learned that answering in the moment only feeds the idea that my time and my access are public property, so I let the void stretch long enough that the calls slowed, and in the quiet I made the choice that mattered most, which was to take the money I had once set aside for my parents' emergencies, roll it together with a portion of what I used to spend patching leaks, and place it into a living structure my attorney had explained in plain language, a container with rules I could write myself and a trustee who is not a relative. A place where my savings and my business reserves could sit beyond the reach of guilt or flattery or the next big idea pitched as a family mission. I retitled what needed retitling. I changed beneficiaries where it made sense. I documented the sources so there would be no debate later, and I stood in a small conference room signing pages while the notary slid them across with efficient hands. And I did not cry or shake or make a speech to the ceiling, because this was not a punishment, it was a repair, and when it was done I walked out with a thin folder and a single email drafted but unsent, an email that said, without heat, that I had secured my accounts, that any request touching my credit or my business was permanently off the table, and that the only conversation I would entertain would take place with a witness present and a very specific document on the table. The revenge that day did not look like a grand gesture. It looked like a bank rejecting a pull that used to go through on the first try. It looked like a vendor smiling and saying they needed a purchase order while my brothers pretended not to hear. It looked like the family group chat raging while my phone stayed on silent, and it looked like a calendar reminder set for the morning after next with the name of a bank branch and the initials of a notary, because the next time I spoke to them, there would be nothing to argue about, only terms to accept or refuse, and the moment they saw what those terms actually were, the calls would stop for a reason they had never expected. They finally convinced me to meet by promising that there would be no surprises, and even though I did not believe them, I agreed, because I wanted the last conversation to happen where paperwork speaks louder than tears. So I chose a branch office with a small conference room and a notary who does not ask personal questions. And I brought a thin folder that held every boundary I had written for myself over the past 2 weeks, along with one new document that would close the book for good, and when my parents sat down with Michael and Daniel flanking them like they were guarding an investment, I let them talk through the script about misunderstandings and family unity and temporary setbacks until they ran out of the usual lines and remembered that they had come here to pull me back into the old arrangement. I told them I was not here to argue or to be persuaded, that I was here to make sure there would be no confusion in the future, and I slid the first sheet across the table, a courteous letter on my attorney's letterhead that summarized the freezes, revocations, and blocked permissions already in place, and I watched the way my father's eyes moved faster over the words when he reached the sentence about any use of my identity or my business being referred to counsel and to law enforcement, which was not a threat but a schedule of consequences, and when he tried to say we could work this out inside the family, I nodded like I had heard him and moved on. Because the time for debates about tone had ended the moment they treated my credit as a family cupboard they could open when hungry. The second page was a clean accounting of what I had covered in the past several years, written in round numbers without interest or commentary. A list that included taxes and medications and deposits and repairs, and those small recurring bills nobody respects until they stop going through. And below the list was a single sentence stating that I was signing a release forgiving all of it and that I would never ask for reimbursement, which made my mother soften for a moment because she thought it meant I was folding, and then she reached for my hand and called me her steady girl while asking if we could sign the cosigner packet and put this behind us, and I turned the third page around so she could read the headline my attorney had suggested. A mutual release and a no-contact clause for financial matters, clear and confirmable and timed with a notary so nobody could later call it a misunderstanding, and she pulled her hand back like the paper was hot, which told me she was starting to understand that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I saved the fourth page for last, because it was the only part that could be read as mercy and as a dare all at once. A short trust summary written in plain language stating that I had placed a measured sum into a parent emergency fund administered by an independent trustee with no relation to me, that the fund could be used only for essentials verified by invoice, and that every disbursement required proof that both sons had contributed at least an equal amount during the same calendar month, after which any money not matched would remain in the trust untouched, and the room changed temperature when they processed that clause because it turned the old machine upside down. And Michael started to speak, and then stopped when the notary cleared her throat and said she could only witness signatures and not arguments, which was the only help I needed from a stranger that day. Daniel tried to bargain, offering a list of hypothetical payments he might make if the bank came through, and I reminded him that the bank had already tried to drag my numbers in without permission and that the window for maybes had closed. And my father tried the story about sacrifice and legacy and blood, and I told him that legacy without reciprocity is just a prettier word for extraction, and that I had been extracted from long enough, and my mother reached for the old guilt that always worked on me, asking if I wanted to be the child who abandoned her parents in their later years, and I looked at the notary and then back at my mother and said that I had established a safe rule-based way to make sure they were not abandoned while making it impossible for anyone to keep using me as a silent wallet, and that if the brothers stepped up then the trust would function like a seat belt. But if they did not then the road would be bumpy and that would be on the drivers, not on the person they once assigned to run behind the car and keep it from rolling. I did not raise my voice, and I did not apologize, and when I asked whether they intended to sign the mutual release acknowledging that I would have no financial contact with them going forward, my father stared at the page like he could will it into saying something different while Michael whispered that this was extreme and Daniel called it spiteful, and I said that spite would have looked like invoices with interest and calls to creditors and a public mess, while this was calm, legal, and final. And then I slid two small envelopes across the table, one holding the spare keys to their house that I had still been carrying out of habit, the other holding the last card tied to any account of mine that they might have forgotten was still in a drawer. And the notary watched me place them there and made a note about returned property, which felt like the last bead on a long thread finally clicking into place. They did not sign right away because the truth never slides down easy when it has been dodged for years, so I gave them the copies and told them the offer remained open for a week and then expired, at which point the emergency fund would be redirected to a donor-advised account that helps women leave financial abuse, and I said that calmly and stood up because there was nothing left to say in that room. And when my mother asked if this meant I was cutting them off forever, I said that I was cutting off the pipelines that had kept me invisible and that they were welcome to know me as a person if they could handle knowing me without access to my accounts. And then I thanked the notary, walked outside, and put my phone on Do Not Disturb while the messages arrived in waves and then slowed into silence. They did sign within the week, and the trustee sent the first quiet email asking for documentation on a medical bill and a utility bill, and I forwarded the instructions and closed the thread, and the calls stopped because there was nothing to argue about. No angle to push, no button to press that did not route to a wall with a plaque that said rules, and for the first time I understood that my revenge had not been about punishing them, it had been about refusing to be the furniture everyone leans on and then ignores, and that realization landed not with fireworks, but with a steady hum that felt like a life starting on my own terms. And when people ask me now what I said that finally shut them up, I tell the truth, which is that I said almost nothing. I just changed where the doors were and handed them a map, and when they realized they could not get in without doing the work, they chose quiet, and that was the moment I knew I had won.